Andy Bicking, Director of Government Relations and Public Policy for Scenic Hudson. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight. We're really glad you could be part of this presentation sponsored by Scenic Hudson, Citizens Climate Lobby, and the Climate Reality Project. Tonight's presentation will be recorded, so if you want to share it with your friends, family, or on social media, watch your inbox for a follow-up email with a YouTube link. At this moment, I'd like to take a quick moment to recognize our leaders of two organizations that are co-sponsoring this tonight with Scenic Hudson, who would like to share a few words. To those of us who are climate activists or involved in the environmental community in the Hudson Valley, they certainly need no introduction. First, Eleanor Saunders from Citizen Climate Lobby. Eleanor?
Yes, hi, thank you, Andy, very much. To introduce Citizens Climate Lobby to those of you that don't know us at this point, I'd like to tell a quick story about the path that was followed by the organization's founder, the late Marshall Saunders, not a relative of mine, unfortunately. Marshall was a successful businessman with a strong moral compass that led him to become active in Rotary Club projects and in other groups that were focused on reducing global poverty. His passion was microfinance, and he started up many projects at a time when this approach was just beginning. But as he did the work, Marshall began to hear more about climate change, and he began to realize how its impacts could destroy the progress that was being made. Then he saw an inconvenient truth, immediately signed up for Al Gore's first training on the slideshow, and therefore we share roots, Tim, with all of you at Climate Reality Project. During a very early presentation at a senior center, a woman asked Marshall, what should we do? Influenced by another advocacy group, Results, that trained citizens to lobby Congress on poverty issues, Marshall responded, what's needed is thousands of ordinary people organized, lobbying their members of Congress with one voice, one message, in a relentless, unstoppable, yet friendly and respectful way. Why don't you do that? The woman said. And in 2007, he did. Citizens Climate Lobby now has more than 200,000 supporters in North America, as well as chapters worldwide. We still lobby for what Marshall and others in the early group saw as the best first step in climate policy, creating an economy-wide price on greenhouse gas emissions with the revenues returned to individual households. In the US, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, based on that framework, was just reintroduced in the 117th Congress and already has attracted 56 co-sponsors. The act that we support would cut US carbon emissions in half by 2030 and put us on a path to net zero emissions by 2050. Dividends from the revenues, we're now calling them carbon cashbacks, especially protect low to middle income households, I should say, that can't afford increased energy costs that a transition to net zero will temporarily create. In addition, the Energy Innovation Act would immediately offer large public health benefits, especially in overburdened communities, as it slashes the emissions of all pollutants associated with fossil fuel use. Although highly effective, we recognize that one policy is definitely not enough. So CCL has been advocating for bills that would incentivize farmers' adoption of climate smart and regenerative practices. At the federal level, our lobbying led to a significant increase in co-sponsors for the growing Climate Solutions Act. And many chapters like our Mid-Hudson and Capital District ones that I'm representing here tonight are working at state and local levels to educate the public, talk with farmers, and lobby elected officials about the enormous contributions to climate mitigation and adaptation that these practices offer for farms and really for all of us in society as a whole. So we thank Citizens Climate Lobby for helping to enrich our understanding tonight of the best policy approaches for achieving these goals. So let me pass this on to Tim Guinea, who's going to say a few words for Climate Reality Project.
Mute myself. Hey, I'm Tim Guinea. I'm with the Climate Reality Project, and I will talk quickly because I want to hear the program. I'm really excited to be putting this on with CCL and Scenic Hudson, who I think Scenic Hudson's done a lot of the heavy lifting. But, you know, we know that there's more carbon sequestered in the first 3 feet of topsoil than all of the trees on Earth. So carbon sequestration is a really important answer and a thing for us all to look at when we're considering climate solutions. The Climate Reality Project in New York are big proponents of the Parker-Hinchey bill S4707, which is actually passed the Senate. In the Assembly, it's A2042, and it would give a tax credit to farmers who maximize carbon sequestration. So we just have a month before the end of session. Please push your Assembly members to support A2042. And thank you very much. I'll turn it back to the good folks at Scenic Hudson.
Thanks, Tim. Together, our hope is that tonight's program helps the Hudson Valley's environmental community understand the opportunity for agricultural lands to help address the climate crisis. And so for the next 25 minutes or so, my colleague Carly Fraccaroli and I will present a brief refresher on climate science, the role that soil can have in sequestering carbon, and then share what social science tells us to help understand the farmer's perspective in this issue. And finally, we'll provide an overview of one exciting opportunity to promote what some call carbon farming through state legislative action in support of the Soil Health and Climate Resiliency Act. So in the meantime, please put your questions in the Q&A anytime during tonight's program. When we get to that, we're very fortunate to have Garrett Boudinot, a research associate at Cornell College of Agricultural and Life Science, to join us for this portion of the discussion, as well as Eleanor Saunders. But for now, we'd like to give a brief overview of this issue. Addressing climate change through management of agricultural lands is a complex undertaking that we really need to look at holistically. The science tells us that crop management practices have the potential to influence absorption of carbon and nitrous oxide on farm soils. And while there are many unanswered questions about how to measure and verify this, one thing is clear: there is a climate benefit. But because the climate crisis is urgent, we must put the practices in place now at the same time as we develop our scientific understanding of the issue on a parallel track. The economics and social dynamics for this issue are also critical. We need to understand fundamentally that asking farmers, who are the stewards of 18% of the land area in the Hudson River Valley, asking them to change how they manage their land comes with a cost. So therefore, our solutions must consider the profit margins of farm businesses and engage with broader philosophical issues that go to the heart of the American psyche, such as what the role of private enterprise is in creating public good. Public policy has an enormous potential to help guide this discussion. Attendance at tonight's presentation clearly demonstrates there's appetite for change and strong interest in this issue. But like everything we know about climate politics, change only happens through community action. So we must be diligent to have our voices heard. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Carly, who will provide us with a refresher on climate science and an overview of the function of soil. Take it away, Carly.
Thank you, Andy. So I want to start off by talking about what everyone, or probably most people, know about climate change. So what we know is that our planet is getting warmer, but climate change isn't just global warming. While the Earth is seeing increasing average temperatures, climate change is also causing more extreme weather events like hurricanes and floods, rising sea levels due to melting ice and thermal expansion because water expands as it warms, and mass migrations of both humans and animals due to land becoming unsustainable for life, whether it's non-arable, unproductive, or simply underwater. And human activities are responsible for almost all of the increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere over the last 150 years. And these greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation, industry, deforestation, electricity, agriculture, and other sources. And we'll see methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases as all types of greenhouse gases created by human activity, but carbon dioxide is the most common. In 2019, 80% of US greenhouse gas emissions were carbon dioxide. And these greenhouse gas emissions come from burning fossil fuels like coal, natural gas, and oil. They cause carbon dioxide to enter the atmosphere. And while carbon dioxide is naturally present in the atmosphere, human activities are adding more. And this causes an imbalance in the carbon cycle, meaning that forests and soils, which serve as natural sinks, so they take in carbon, are unable to remove and store enough carbon dioxide to prevent an increase in the atmosphere. So we urgently need to reduce human-made carbon dioxide emissions. And at the same time, we must do our best to support the natural processes of forests and soils that remove that excess carbon from the soil and sequester it. So a little bit about the nexus between agriculture, soil, and climate is that agricultural activities such as crop and livestock production for food contribute 23% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So not too small of a number. And if we look at the US, the EPA reports about 10% coming from ag. And examples of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture include nitrous oxide emissions from the application of fertilizers and irrigation practices, and livestock producing methane as part of their normal digestive process. And out of those 23% greenhouse gas emissions coming from agriculture, 8 to 12% come from cropping systems. And since the 1970s, traditional cropland management practices have accounted for a loss of 1/3 of our topsoils, which are essential for crop production, because not only does topsoil have the greatest amount of nutrients that plants need, but also the most important nutrients that give the plants the ability to help us. So taking a step back, breaking this whole topic down a bit, we get to carbon. And carbon is immensely important to agriculture, and it is in fact essential to all life on Earth. The carbon cycle is the process of carbon atoms circulating between the Earth and the atmosphere and back again. So carbon dioxide is atmospheric carbon, and that gets pulled out of the air and water through the process of photosynthesis. So that's when plants take carbon dioxide, water, and light energy and turn that into oxygen and carbohydrates. And in this way, plants are able to return atmospheric carbon to the soil. And as soils are natural carbon sinks, managing croplands for soil health can help to sequester atmospheric carbon. So healthier soils with more organic matter and healthy, diverse soil organisms can sequester more carbon. And knowing this, a shift in working land management from traditional agricultural practices to regenerative, healthy soils practices can reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere and help to mitigate the impacts of climate change. So what can we do to manage land to sequester more carbon? Firstly, healthy soils sequester more carbon. So prioritizing soil health in the way cropland is managed, such as practicing reduced tillage, cover cropping, and crop rotations, will not only help the soil and its microorganisms that are essential to human health, but the climate as well. We can also avoid converting lands that are currently natural into working lands. Diverse ecosystems with undisturbed soils are proven to be more efficient at sequestering carbon than agricultural monocultures, so one crop, or even polycultures, more than one crop. Looking at forests, having more trees enhances the sequestration and storage capacity of the forest carbon sink. And forests store carbon in multiple carbon pools. And those include live above ground trees, roots, deadwood, leaf litter, and soil organic matter. And there are multiple passive and active forest management practices that emphasize the sequestration and storage of carbon. And fun fact, approximately 1/3 of the forest products harvested in the Northeast US are made into products such as furniture, flooring, and lumber. And since these sit in your house, you walk on them, you put your food on them, they have long lifespans. They don't degrade, they aren't exposed to the elements. And as a result, they store that carbon for long periods of time. So if you're interested in more ways that you can read into this, dive deeper into these topics, we recommend these 3 resources for you to either watch or read. The first is Kiss the Ground, which is a documentary that you can watch on Netflix. And in it, science experts and celebrity activists unpack the ways in which the Earth's soil may be the key to combating climate change and preserving the planet. The second one, Drawdown, is a book that highlights solutions to reverse or at least mitigate global warming and climate change. And that includes topics on soil health and topics on agriculture. And finally, The Soil Will Save Us is a book that talks about how to heal the land and turn atmospheric carbon into beneficial soil carbon, kind of like what we've talked about today. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Andy to talk more about the economics of soil health.
Thanks so much, Carly. I think as everyone can probably appreciate, the opportunity for natural and working lands and agricultural lands in particular to be part of the climate solution that we need to create in our society is really immense. Yet our understanding of this really needs to be balanced with the economic systems that got us where we are today and help us understand how we can really create holistic solutions that bring together our science, our policy, and our economy all together. Generally speaking, just to give you a little bit of background, since World War II, public policy really encouraged the use of chemical intervention on farms to reduce labor, fight pests and weeds, and provide nutrition to crops. 75 years of these policies have not been all bad. If you just stop and think about the number of people that we fed, that is really, really remarkable. And that's a public good that we want to try to hold on to. Yet at the same time, many of these practices that were promoted also caused negative environmental impacts. They often increased erosion in certain situations. They depleted soil nutrients, compacting soil and further exacerbating the need for further chemical inputs onto farms. At the same time, one of the other big trends that you can see in the graph here is that as the number of farms have decreased, the average farm size has increased. And in some ways, this tracks with the industrialization of agriculture nationwide. For many, this approach to agriculture has been perceived as economically necessary, but fortunately things are changing. For farm soils to really become part of our climate solutions, we must reduce use of practices with the negative consequences and at the same time maintain our ability to feed our communities. So what do healthy soil systems look like, and what changes should we be focused on making in terms of policy and economic issues? Some practices, such as low-till and cover cropping, create many benefits. They basically work by increasing the organic matter content of soil, which maintains the integrity of networks of microorganisms that make soil their home. This has the effect of holding carbon and nitrous oxide in the ground, as you heard from Carly, and essentially retaining the nutrients that plants rely on for food. I'm sure Garrett, our scientist here, would quibble with some of my generalizations here, but we wanted to just kind of offer this from a very high level and provide a big picture overview. And certainly we're glad he will be here to get into the weeds quite literally with us later in the Q&A session. This approach offers, really a co-benefit of stabilizing topsoil and preventing unnecessary loss of soil moisture. There's a lot of language out there to describe these practices. Some call them resilient agriculture, regenerative agriculture, or organic agriculture, but they all share a few key principles in common. First, they encourage the regeneration of topsoil, not its loss. They increase the diversity of organisms that rely on soil. They improve water quality. They expand the public benefits of farming for the entire ecosystem, and they help land be more resilient in the face of a changing climate. Finally, they can actually sequester harmful compounds that contribute to climate change and, importantly, promote the overall economic viability of the farm. So to figure out how to make this change here in the Hudson Valley, we need to understand how our agricultural economy relates to the broader whole. And I'll first say that I think we can probably all appreciate every farm operation is unique. If you've ever been to the local farm stand or the market and you talk to your local farmer, you realize very quickly that they're all different sizes, they're producing different things, they have different family needs that they're trying to manage, and different economic realities and financial realities that they're balancing to put food on your table. So there are no cookie cutter formulas to our farm economy. And there are no standard solutions for every farm operation. But there are some things that we can say for the Hudson Valley region that really kind of help us understand the opportunity from a regional perspective. Economically, we're really well positioned. Hudson Valley farms serve about 90% of Grow NYC green markets in New York City and are also suppliers to local restaurants, groceries, and other food outlets. And our agricultural land can actually help meet New York City's estimated $600 million of unmet demand for regionally produced food. So just think about what that means, being so close to that market opportunity here in our region. And the market is also generally very well educated. They care about where their food comes from, and they're climate smart. So the opportunity really to have a value add at the consumer level is quite significant. Second, our natural resources create a lot of opportunities in our region. Our farm soils and agricultural landscapes are diverse. So just consider the famous black dirt region of Orange County compared to the orchards of Ulster, or the dairies and vegetable and row crops in Columbia and Dutchess, or Greene, or elsewhere. All of these together create a lot of diverse opportunities to explore and tailor approaches for how we can sequester carbon. And finally, our human resources in the Valley are outstanding. We have diverse, relatively small, family-owned farms compared to the rest of the state and nation. We're about half the average size of the farm in New York State, and New York State is about half the size of the average farm nationally. So we're operating at a scale that can allow our region to test new practices and adapt land management practices relatively quickly. We also have great organizations. We're home to the birth of the nation's young farmers movement through the National Young Farmers Coalition, have well-regarded environmental groups, excellent extension and soil and water conservation district networks that have close ties with agricultural producers. So with the science and economy framing this issue, we can stop to think about practical steps to encourage the adoption of soil health practices on Hudson Valley and New York State farms. This change is going to be implemented by the farmers themselves, not us as an activist community, nor by government. However, both have a very important role to play. To better understand the farmer perspective, in 2016, Scenic Hudson commissioned a study, the Climate Resilient Agricultural Initiative, Cultivating Climate Solutions in the Hudson Valley, that you can access through our website. It identified 5 key characteristics of the region and things we needed to think about to encourage these practices. First, we need to have technical education and support available to farmers, notably through peer-to-peer learning. Farmers learn from farmers best. Also, the need to communicate about this issue in terms of co-benefits. I think as climate activists, we can all appreciate not everyone embraces climate change like we do, but good soil health practices address climate issues and more traditional concerns like water quality, farm viability, and economic goals. Third, voluntary programs are perceived most favorably by farmers. Regulation and top-down approaches tend not to be well received. Fourth, the importance of encouraging collaboration between researchers and practitioners so we can continue to learn from each other. And finally, and this is perhaps one of the most important points, there's a broadly recognized need locally and statewide and nationally for financial incentives to implement soil health practices. Fundamentally, again, farms are businesses. We're asking them to change the way they work. This represents a cost, and there are very few market-based incentives for this change to occur. So public grants, private market incentives, whatever tools we can bring to bear are increase the opportunity we have for carbon farming to take place. So in summary, voluntary incentives for soil health practices really should be our mantra when calling for climate action on farms. We're probably all generally familiar with New York's climate law that calls for an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And the natural resource sector has an important role to play. It's actually perhaps the only sector of our economy that can both reduce its own emissions and absorb the emissions of other sectors, making it the only set of industries that can achieve a negative greenhouse emissions output. Much progress has already been made in our region. Many farmers are putting these practices at place, such as Hudson Carbon, Stonehouse Farms in Columbia County. We're also politically connected. Scenic Hudson's president and others serve on the Ag and Forestry Advisory Panel to the Climate Action Council. And we're very fortunate that local Assemblywoman Dee Dee Barrett has been a leader in promoting carbon farming and advancing legislative and budgetary initiatives that are moving the needle on this issue. Senator Michelle Henchy, also from the Hudson Valley, has been in a critical leadership role here. In fact, both of them have been working with Assembly Ag Chair Donna Lepardo to promote the Soil Health and Climate Resiliency Act. I just want to give a quick big picture overview of what this legislation does, and then we'll open it up for our Q&A. Big picture, it amends a section of law that originated following the Dust Bowl and has not been seriously amended since the 1980s, when water quality goals were integrated into the program. So now is really a great time to be having a discussion about how we can be encouraging soil and water conservation districts and the State Department of Agriculture to do more. This bill does that. It is kind of step one by defining soil health and soil health practices for the very first time in law, also establishing a soil health initiative that will encourage farmers to adopt soil health practices. It also codifies the existing climate resiliency agriculture initiative that encourages the mitigation of greenhouse gases on farmland and promotes the adoption of adaptation of farmland to projected climate impacts. Now, the bill also charges the state to develop a soil health standard for different and diverse regions of the state, something I'm very excited about, because there's nothing like a goal to motivate change. And finally, it directs our soil and water conservation districts, the primary mechanism we have, one of the best in the nation actually, for delivering scientific information and practical recommendations to farmers. It directs them to promote soil health practices and respond to climate change as one of their primary goals. So we see this bill as a really important first step in creating the policy framework for New York State to do more on this issue. We have a call to action for this bill that you will be receiving in your inbox soon. And our policy staff at Scenic Hudson, of course, is always ready to help connect you with your lawmakers or answer any questions that you may have. But for now, we're going to end the formal presentation right on time. We're going to open it up for discussion. We'll be joined by Eleanor Saunders from Citizens Climate Lobby, who you met earlier, and Garrett Boudinot from Cornell University's College of Agriculture and Life Science to help answer some of these questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A. We'll take them in the order that they were received. And since you haven't met Garrett first, it's my pleasure to say a few words about him. He completed his PhD in geological sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder on the ecological impacts of climate change after receiving his bachelor's in both geology and religious studies from the College of Charleston. He now works on agricultural solutions to climate change, natural resource management, community resilience, and outreach and communications. And he's also a community science fellow with the American Geophysical Union. Personally, he likes gardening, fishing, hunting, and hiking. And if you get a chance to Google him and find his bio on Squarespace, you'll notice that he's also a talented musician, and being a new resident to New York, may be looking for members of a band to play with. So there's also early in the chat, you'll see a great article he contributed to that appeared in The Hill, one of our nation's most prominent public policy periodicals published in Washington. So at this time, we're going to open up the Q&A, and Althea, if you would pose some questions to the panel, that would be great.
Great. This first question would be for Garrett. Isn't the 23% of global GHG emissions from not only agriculture, but also the food system as a whole?
Yeah, I love that question, because I think when we're talking about agriculture and food production and climate change, there's no question that the food system as a whole is contributing to a lot of the ecological and climate problems that we see globally today, and needs reform. And so that question kind of touches or highlights that. There's actually and this is very timely, just less than 2 weeks ago, a paper came out in Nature Food, one of the top food system science journals in the world. that addresses this. And so I pulled that up for context. So I thought Carly did a great job of pitching the metrics of agriculture and climate. I use that about 23 to 25% global greenhouse gas emissions contribution metric as well. This paper its title is Food Systems Are Responsible for a Third of Global Anthropogenic Greenhouse Gas Emissions. They modeled and looked at data and found that if you take agriculture plus all of the transport and waste and all of that we would call food systems, that it actually represents 34% of overall greenhouse gas emissions. So I think Carly was spot on with the number there, but whoever asked the question, also really important I'm glad that they brought up food systems as a whole, we can rethink and make more climate smart.
Great. There's probably a few more questions that Garrett can answer, but first, someone asked, what can I do as a Hudson Valley resident who cares about climate change? And I think, Tim, you could probably take that. Or Eleanor.
It's always hard to, why is it so hard to unmute? A year after the pandemic, I think I would know how to do it. You know, I think the Hudson Valley is doing a lot of extraordinary work. And I think the CLCPA is an extraordinary document, and they've convened unbelievable groups of people to try and come up with the path forward. My big concern is that we're not going to legislate our way out, that NIMBYism is going to affect people as they see things change, and that we need to keep talking. We all need to keep talking, and we particularly need to stop just talking in environmental circles. We need to talk to people who don't believe any of this is true. We need to step across that line. In my opinion, the biggest failure of the environmental movement is in our lack of reaching out. And I think it's going to be essential. There's a fantastic, in John Bowermaster's words, kind of ecosystem, or these are Sean Daig's words. That's where I got those words. An ecosystem of extraordinary environmental organizations, and some of the greatest environmentalists in the country are here. So the biggest thing I would say is don't be alone. Join one of these groups. There's nothing lonely about being an environmentalist in the Hudson Valley unless you choose that to be the fact. And by joining one of these groups, you'll be able to be much more powerful than you are on your own.
Thank you, Tim. Garrett, this next one definitely, I think, is for you. Some farmers continue to use high-intensity tillage practice because the soil type of their land has poor drainage capacity. Example, Des Moines loam soil in Iowa. For soil types that have poor drainage capacity where low tillage might not be possible, has there been any formulation for strategies that these farmers can use instead?
Great question. And I think we hear that all the time when we talk with farmers. I think low till and no till has gotten a lot of traction with the NRCS and the USDA and in the discussion of agricultural solutions to climate change. But of course, there's a reason farmers till. And so often farmers say, well, for my specific farm location practice, that doesn't make sense. Am I just left out of the equation? And the answer is absolutely not. There are a number of what we would call climate smart agricultural practices, or what we would lump under carbon farming, that farmers can take. And that's what is so great about agricultural solutions to climate change, is that there is no one size fits all prescription or silver bullet, that depending on the farm size, crop type, climate, soil type, there are a number of different practices farmers can adopt that work with what their resources are. And so Andy mentioned some of them, like cover cropping as well, which is also growing in the NRCS and USDA literature. What we study, particularly in my group here at Cornell, are what are called soil amendments. And so these are things that farmers can add to the soil. Sometimes it actually improves drainage. And so you can add some soil amendments that help reduce tilling over time. But then these soil amendments also contribute to those vibrant soil microbiomes that Andy described as contributing to soil organic carbon formation. They help reduce emissions by making soils retain nutrients over time. They help decrease the inputs of other things like fertilizers, which can contribute more greenhouse gases and have a carbon footprint to get to the farm. And one of the things that we really focus on in our group here is actually soil amendments that, and this is something that wasn't mentioned, that can increase the inorganic carbon side of the equation. And so we apply things like silicate minerals. We use a very technical term, rock dust. And when these are applied to agricultural soils, they weather. That actually acts as a sponge, which draws down carbon dioxide, stores it in a water-soluble form or even as a mineral. And this can hold carbon in soils for hundreds of thousands to millions of years. And so soil amendments are also something that's readily available to farmers. Most farmers are applying something to their soils, and these are a great way to increase carbon in soils. Two other buzzwords that you'll often hear of practices that are available are things like agroforestry, which is adding perennials or trees to cropping systems. And once you add animals into the equation, there's things like silvopasture, which is mixing grazers with perennial trees. And then Andy and Carly both mentioned things like crop rotations or having polycultures of crops. So all of these are available. There are some that I'm skimming over even here for farmers to take advantage of and increase their soil carbon.
Great, thank you. This question is for Andy Bicking. When it comes to this incentives for carbon farming practices, are you at all concerned that a focus on scale and verification will result in these incentive resources going disproportionately to larger, more conventional farms? How do we ensure that small scale regenerative farmers who are already farming this way can get rewarded for these practices too?
Yeah, that is a great question, Liz, and really an important one to focus on. I would say it is an issue and it's a policy concern that we really need to be very, very attentive to. And I think there's a couple issues at play here. You know, first, just strictly from a provincial New York, kind of New England, Northeast perspective, as I said earlier, our farms are much smaller than they are elsewhere in the country. New York's Hudson Valley farms are half the average size of New York farms, and New York farms are half the average size of the farms throughout the country. So we have an interest in this issue beyond the climate benefit that we're looking to achieve. It's also very important for the overall viability of our agricultural economy. But I would think that the small farm sizes we have that tend to be owned by families at a higher level than they are elsewhere in the country gives us a great amount of flexibility, and it also helps us be nimble. But this also can't just be a numbers game. It has to be a people-oriented solution. All carbon counts, and we need to be finding ways to capture it on big farms and small farms. I would also say that the importance of talking about this issue again in terms of co-benefits is really, really significant in this context. There's so many benefits in addition to storing carbon or nitrous oxide, like achieving water quality goals that have powerful impacts on communities. So if we start looking at and trying to redefine this discussion in terms of some of those co-benefits and other population centers that are going to be affected, I think it's very important. And finally, I think there's kind of an ethical issue at play here. And that is that so much of our agricultural programs throughout the nation traditionally have rewarded what I will refer to and probably get scolded for referring to as bad actors, right? They're people who are managing their land and that are creating problems. And so we tend to focus on the problems that we have and throw money at those and try to change them for the better. But there's a lot of good actors out there that are already creating climate benefit and a lot of other co-benefits. And we need to really recognize the role that they play and continue to center them in our discussions, make sure that their practices and stories are really promoted, and also make sure that they receive whatever financial incentives we can engineer through private markets or public policy. And this is a solution that has really been at the forefront of both Assemblywoman Dee Dee Barrett, Assemblywoman Donna Lepardo, and Senator Michelle Henchy's mind in their authorship of the Soil Health and Climate Resiliency Act. They actually charged the Department of Ag and Markets with looking at diverse agricultural operations in urban, suburban, and rural communities. They also make sure that farmers of color and those from BIPOC-led organizations are included in policy discussions and scientific coordination discussions that will be taking place if the bill becomes law, and fundamentally recognize the diversity of agricultural scale of operation throughout the state. So I think that is something that is currently under discussion. We're not to the finish line on that bill or that issue more broadly, but we're getting close. And I think the more we can keep raising this, the more durable solutions we will be able to create.
Thank you, Andy. The next question is for Carly, who covered the science portion of this presentation tonight, and perhaps Andy would chime in as well. Though the methods used in restorative agriculture definitely improve the soil, isn't the sequestration of carbon in the soil for helping climate change still being debated scientifically, especially since carbon in the soil will change from place to place and over time, and is hard to predict?
Thanks, Althea, and thanks, Elizabeth. That's a good question. And I would say soil health, while soil health isn't a new topic, we're looking at it from a different lens. We're looking at it through that lens of climate change and how soil really can sequester that carbon in the ground. Of course, we're not going to say that it will reverse climate change, but we do think that it can help. And I'd love to ask Garrett to chime in on this from his perspective at Cornell.
Yeah, I'm happy to, because this is the question highlights the uncertainty that is very real in the literature about how much carbon can soils hold, how different practices might increase carbon storage across different soil types, crop types, climates. I think that the literature is very consistent in highlighting that current agricultural practices contribute more greenhouse gas emissions than unmanaged soils, highlighting that we can change how we manage soils and cropping and agricultural systems to reduce their emissions, first off. And second, there is widespread consensus that we have lost a significant amount of soil carbon that can be restored. And so really the uncertainty is how we do that most effectively. And so some of that is mixing those different practices that I talked about. Some of it is more on kind of what we call the research and development side of things, of really working with farmers, working with working land managers, and figuring out how we can adopt the practices in a way that is economically viable, in a way that is rapid enough to meet the challenge of climate change, and a way that can scale across climates, soil types, and crops. So there is some uncertainty in how we do it, but the general direction and the goals, I think the literature is clear on that.
Great, thank you. And I'd like to remind everyone, if your questions didn't get answered or you have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to the presenters tonight. The information is posted for you to reach out and ask more questions. The next question is for probably Eleanor and Tim from a high school earth science teacher in Red Hook, and maybe Garrett can round out the question. I'm a high school earth science teacher in Red Hook. Many of my students this year, mostly around the age of 14, are really interested in what they can do regarding climate change. Is there anything they can do at home or locally that can help with this cause? Are there certain plants they should grow, parent permission pending, of course, or soils that they should use?
Eleanor, you're muted.
Eleanor, can you unmute yourself?
I just did. Am I okay now? Sorry about that. My problem is not knowing, remembering how, but remembering to do it. Anyhow, thanks for that question. It really has a lot of potential answers. One of them is that many environmental organizations now are really welcoming participation by high school students and college students and even younger students. For Citizens Climate Lobby locally, we have a chapter that meets on the Bard College campus. So there are, in fact, a lot of students connected with that particular chapter. If your students in Red Hook would be interested in finding out more about that, you can go to the citizensclimatelobby.org website, and there are links to connect you to local chapters. This would be the Mid-Hudson chapter. CCL has been really working hard to increase the number of students that are, part of our volunteers, that do outreach with us, that go to lobby meetings with members of Congress or state level elected officials. So there are plenty of ways in which your students could participate, and certainly in our organization, and I know in others as well. Tim, do you want to?
I do. I got confused because a chipmunk just ran up a pawpaw tree right outside my window, and I've never seen one do that. The one thing that I just think of around this stuff is that there's an opportunity in climate change literacy education to really touch so many different disciplines. I mean, Eleanor just touched on, civics and government, and there's science stuff, and there's, I can tell you Shakespeare and I can tell you Chekhov that has stuff that feels like it's about, literally there's not a subject area that can't have some part of climate put into it. My organization is actually working on trying to see if we can't get approval to teach teachers, to give presentations to teachers, which would count for your CTLEs. So I just think that there's a big wide opening. And the other thing is to recognize, of course, that big social change has almost always been led not by old people like the people on this panel, but by the young people in your classroom, and that there's such an opportunity to learn from their vigor and energy and optimism, and frankly, on this crisis, their ethical high ground. So I just pass that on, and thank you for teaching.
Garrett, would you like to answer the question about the plants and the soils?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is something where when I was a high school student, I learned about climate change. I was in the generation where really my whole scientific curriculum from the start was around environmental and climate problems. And so one of the things that I immediately went to, and I think a lot of folks in my generation went to, is studying the problem of climate change. And I can tell you, as someone who did that for over a decade, that gets exhausting very quickly. And I'm hopeful in the young folks that our group works with, is that we're seeing a shift from focusing on the problem, trying to understand it better, which is certainly important, but a shift from that to imagining the future we want to see, focusing on the solutions. A climate scientist who I really respect and work with often says that climate change is really a design problem, that really it's up to us to imagine the future that we want to see and design it creatively. And to Tim's point, that's something that our young people are well equipped to do. And so I think when it comes to what plants we grow, how we manage our landscapes, it's really thinking, sure, we can think specifically about increasing natives or increasing biodiverse plant populations. Those are things that clearly will increase soil carbon and soil health in your own backyard. But then also thinking more broadly about how will we use our landscapes? Where are we currently managing land and soil in a way that is contributing to greenhouse gases where it doesn't need to? Or where can we kind of in our own backyards or in our own neighborhoods, communities, where can we change how we relate with that landscape to make it more resilient and to increase that soil carbon? And I do feel like with the young people we work with, they're often more observant and take less for granted than many of us do. And I think that's something that high school students are well equipped to do.
Great. Garrett, I think most of the remaining questions are also going to be for you. The first one, what is the contribution of production agriculture to global GHG emissions when land use and land use change are taken out?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Certainly land use and land use change, everything from deforestation, those are certainly large contributors to climate change. But I was actually running the numbers last week, working on a model that took into account the historical changes in forest land area and compared that to global greenhouse gas emissions, and that was not as direct. And so I do think it's harder to piece apart than what I'm willing to make a claim about here. Certainly, I think Carly and Andy in their presentation highlighted the importance of not expanding our cropland and pastureland, and the word you might find in some literature is highlighting agricultural intensification. So there's obviously the social component to our current environmental and climate situation where we're increasing human populations, and already the human populations today could have more nutritious diets. And so how can we fulfill that need without expanding deforestation, without expanding croplands? And so if we can increase the productivity of our current croplands, maybe that would reduce agriculture's contribution to climate change without necessarily having to change the actual land use. That's a really interesting question, though. I think that would lend itself to a great research project in and of itself.
Great, thank you, Garrett. Andy, there's a couple of questions here about biochar. I was wondering if you would take a shot at answering them first, and then if necessary, then Garrett could chime in. Question is, what is your opinion of biochar as a soil enhancer? And a follow-up question that's related, is there a role for biochar that is economically feasible?
Those are good questions, and I can just maybe chime in a little bit from a policy perspective on them. But in layperson's terms, biochar is basically storing carbon in soil by burning organic matter in a low oxygen environment. So the layperson's term is we're making charcoal and putting that in the soil. And there's a well-documented kind of bunch of literature out there that talks about what the benefits are to soil from that perspective. On a policy level, I know at the state capitol in Albany, it's something that people are still giving some thought to. And in that perspective, their views are not set, and some people consider it controversial. And while I don't have a personal opinion, I think the two perspectives that are out there is one, the benefit is you're putting carbon in the soil and that's preventing it from getting to the atmosphere. But the other perspective is, you have to burn it in order to create that charcoal-like material, through pyrolysis. And there's some energy transmission that happens there, and there's consumption of oxygen, which is also important in the entire carbon cycle and our understanding of climate change. So that's about the extent of my understanding and what I hear many lawmakers talking about. Garrett, I'm sure, could provide a much more sophisticated answer than I can, but for those main reasons, I think it remains a controversial issue among many policymakers at this time.
Yeah, I agree that the practicality or the ability to scale is probably the more difficult to understand and controversial issue there. And I will say I'm biased. Cornell has one of the top biochar research programs in the world. And so I get to work with some of the smartest minds in biochar, and I'm very fortunate for that. And so I've seen some of the trials here where biochar of different compositions has been shown to increase the water holding capacity of soils very significantly. That alone can, as Andy and Carly described, increase soil organic carbon content. I've seen how it changes the nutrient cycling. It helps retain nutrients, and so that things like nitrogen, which can contribute to nitrous oxide emissions from soils, which has about a 250 times more powerful warming potential than CO2. Biochar can significantly reduce that. It improves the fertility of soils, and so that in places where people are again trying to grow food for growing populations, it makes that more feasible. And in our own group, in our trials in California, we're actually using wood that is harvested from forests that would otherwise be kindling for forest fires and repurposing that in working lands as biochar. So kind of going back to Andy's co-benefits, there's even co-benefits for some of these specific amendments in their production, such as kind of mitigating the potential forest fires in addition to increasing soil carbon. But I think Andy was absolutely right. It's really, how do we scale it? How do we get it to farmers who would need it? One of the things that we like to pitch is a potential future where farmers would have, just like there are currently agricultural cooperatives where small farmers can be competitive in a global large agricultural marketplace, we might have carbon cooperatives where farmers of smaller scale can come together, pool resources to acquire things like a biochar pyrolysis kiln, the actual infrastructure you need to manufacture and produce biochar. How can we get that to the farmers at scale? And thinking about different policies, different organizational strategies for that, I think is going to be really critical in the coming decade.
Well, we're almost at time, but I think we can probably get a couple more questions in related to the biochar. Someone asked, are you looking into techniques that have a reputation for increasing soil microbiological health, such as biodigester compost or microbiological soil inoculants? And that could be, you know, a Garrett or Andy question.
Boy, that's a technical one beyond my bachelor's in agricultural science. So Garrett, I'll defer to you if you've got a perspective on that one.
I'm happy to talk about this. This is actually something that our group is studying directly. And so we are doing trials where we are working with certain soil amendments, like I mentioned, that rock dust, and adding it with microbial inoculum on cornfields and seeing how we understand that rock dust can increase soil inorganic carbon formation. We understand how microbial inoculum can increase soil microbiology. How do those work together? And that gets at what I was saying earlier about kind of thinking about these practices together and how they might work for different farmers. And I think in Carly and Andy's discussion earlier about soil microbiology, there is kind of a whole, and Andy said I would quibble with his discussion. I thought it was great, and we can go as complex as we want, but really the idea is the more biodiverse and self-resilient the soil microbiome is, the more resistant it will be to degrading organic matter over the long term, the more it will be able to hold on to water and nutrients, reducing the need for farmer inputs. But also on a molecular scale, the more transformations that organic matter will undergo and interact with other environmental constituents that help retain it in the soil. So Carly's description of carbon cycling in the soil was really great, that there's a natural retention and a natural release. And by improving the quality of that soil microbiome, we can slow down that decomposition side of the equation and increase the carbon retention side of the equation. And I love that this question mentioned anaerobic digesters and manure compost, because that is also something our group works closely with. And again, here at Cornell, we've got a number of dairy farm partners through the Pro Dairy program here that we're working with, because again, these are opportunities to not only reduce waste and reduce the emissions from agricultural waste, from manure, lagoons, and other things like that, but those anaerobic digesters actually produce renewable natural gas, which could be helpful in a kind of future renewable energy perspective. And again, they produce both solid and liquid, what we call digestate. This is a much more stable organic form that can then be applied to soils as a soil amendment. And so that was a very well-informed question that highlights some of the cutting edge research that's going on at Cornell. Again, how do we optimize that and get it to scale? That's the real question right now.
Thank you, Garrett. I think we have time for maybe one more question, Andy, and the last two questions are actually related regarding hemp. Hemp is the most efficient CO2 to biomass conversion crop as long as it's grown outdoors. There are several regional farmers who utilize this plant for several of its numerous benefits, carbon sequestration among them. Now that recreational cannabis has become legal in New York State, there will be a huge corporate push for indoor grow facilities, which significantly add a huge carbon footprint. Does anyone have thoughts on how we can incentivize outdoor grown cannabis for those who will enter this arena?
It's a good question. I think it really gets to the core of the issue, which is this is an emerging policy question because of the change in our broader culture and New York State now embracing recreational use of marijuana, but also several years prior embracing the agricultural cultivation of hemp and really promoting it as a crop. And you can see it and smell it in many areas of the Hudson Valley, especially in the summer. I know where I live in Ulster County, just north of the thruway exit in Kingston. You drive by with your windows open in the summertime, and it's you smell that very, very pungent smell. So I think my quick answer there is on the policy front. I think that's a discussion that the state should probably be having. And there's a couple formats or venues that it's taking place in. One, the Department of Agriculture and Markets has a special hemp program that you can find on their website. They've got a way for engaging in these questions from an agricultural perspective. The Department of Health also has recently launched a program and initiative to deal with how we're going to be regulating this. And there is an environmental aspect to this question as well. And I think that's something that's just going to get sorted out in the years to come by the executive branch and the legislature as well. But if I recall, I think the question also had a second part to it, which was to understand a little bit more about the incentives to reward good actors who are in a continual state of improvement of soil health through whatever agricultural techniques they're using, whether it's growing hemp or something else. And that policy and that opportunity is, again, something that's being developed. I think the places to be looking to advance discussions in that is if the Soil Health and Climate Resiliency Act passes, which we're very hopeful that it does, and if it's signed by the governor, the State Department of Agriculture and Markets will be going through a period of rulemaking around the law, and they'll figure out really how to implement it at the agency level. So there's going to be a public comment period if we get there. And it's a great place for people concerned about the issue of rewarding so-called good actors in this space could really weigh in. And secondly, in terms of federal legislation, 2023 is not that far away. And those of you who have followed the Farm Bill know that the Farm Bill is going to be renegotiated kind of as we speak and leading up hopefully for some sort of introduction of a bill in a few years, and that we'll have a new Farm Bill in 2023. And there's a big opportunity to engage policymakers at the federal level around this. And we're really lucky here in New York State. Senator Gillibrand has a long history of engagement with the Senate Agricultural Committee, and here in the Hudson Valley, we're very lucky that Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney and Congressman Antonio Delgado both serve on the Agricultural Committee. So they and others are in a really important place to be able to influence this discussion.
And if I can just chime in, this is a topic close to my heart, not just because, as Andy said, I did my PhD in Boulder, Colorado, but it's also close to my heart because we will actually be starting our first 6-acre soil amendment plus fiber hemp demonstration trial here at Cornell, starting in just a couple weeks. We'll be getting seeds in the ground. And to the question asker's point, our hope is that we can demonstrate to farmers how with certain agricultural management practices, we can not only grow really good fiber hemp, but also do it in a way that sequesters carbon dioxide, providing more economic viability to doing indoor cannabis grow as opposed, or excuse me, outdoor cannabis grow in a way that is climate smart, as opposed to those carbon intensive indoor grows. So just wanted to make a pitch for that. And if you're interested in how that goes, keep an ear out. I'm sure there will be some media on the results of that in the coming months.
Well, great questions, everybody, and really appreciate the high level of interaction we've had. Just to wrap things up, since we're a little bit past time, those of you who signed up for this program will be receiving some follow-up information, including an action link you can take to support the bill that we've been discussing. We will also include in that a link to the recorded program from tonight, so you can go back and revisit it and share it with others. And we'll make an effort to get the PowerPoint slides there as well for those of you who would like to have kind of a printed reference or an on-screen reference for this conversation. So this is a series of events that Scenic Hudson will be doing over the course of the year under the ground control moniker. The next event that we will be doing will probably be at some point in August. There has been a really exciting research effort underway in the Hudson Valley known as the Hudson Valley Carbon Farming Pilot, which is a study that was been promoted by New York State under the leadership of Assemblywoman Dee Barrett and Governor Cuomo, looking at developing some of these practices and farms in the region. And we will be providing a briefing midway through the study to share some of the data and information that our partners at the Dutchess County Soil and Water Conservation District and the State Soil and Water Conservation Committee have begun to understand through the study. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, thank you so much for your participation. It really helps embolden all of our climate activity here in the Hudson Valley and is really helping us excel as a region and really contributing proactively towards climate solutions for all of us. So thank you very much for your engagement, and we look forward to the next time when we can talk some more.